the protective haven. The first scream came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. It began somewhere beyond the eastern tree line, deep in the black forest behind the farmhouse. A long, ragged howl. Then another answered it. Then another. Within seconds, the woods seemed to come alive. The sound rolled through the trees in waves. High-pitched shrieks followed by deep, guttural barks that sounded almost human. Something crashed through the underbrush. Branches snapped. Leaves rustled violently. Then came the scratching. 3 slow strokes against the front door. Scratch. 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 Everyone inside froze. Elias Mercer stood at the kitchen window with the shotgun pressed against his chest. His wife, Margaret, held their youngest daughter against her shoulder. Their son Daniel stood beside the wood stove, pale and trembling. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Another scratch. This one harder. Scratch. Margaret whispered, "They're back." Elias stared at the door. They never left. For 3 weeks, the Mercer family had been trapped inside the farmhouse. They had boarded every window. They had nailed wooden planks across the doors. They had dragged the dining table against the front entrance and pushed the refrigerator against the back door. At night, they turned off every light. They rationed canned beans, flour, dried meat, and whatever vegetables remained in the root cellar. They had stopped using the generator except for a few minutes each evening. They were terrified of making noise, terrified of attracting attention, because something was hunting them. Everyone in the county knew the stories. People had whispered about the creatures for generations. Feral things that lived beyond the old logging roads. Things that came out after dark. Things that could smell blood from miles away. Hunters had disappeared. Travelers had vanished from their cars. Livestock were sometimes found torn apart in fields, their bodies stripped almost completely clean. And occasionally someone would claim they had seen one. Tall, bent, fast, covered in matted hair, with long arms and fingers that ended in black, hooked claws. Most people dismissed the stories, until the disappearances started increasing, until Elias saw one himself. It had been standing at the edge of his field, watching the house. He had seen it just after sunset, for perhaps 5 seconds. Then it had disappeared into the trees. That night they boarded the house, and the creatures came. Every night. They scratched. They screamed. They walked around the house. Sometimes Elias could hear their breathing beneath the floorboards. Sometimes something would throw itself against the walls hard enough to shake the dishes. Once, something pressed its face against the kitchen window. Elias saw only a pair of pale eyes staring back at him. He fired. The thing vanished. But there was blood on the glass. After that, they stopped looking outside. They simply waited. Days passed. Then weeks. Margaret began marking the days on the kitchen wall with a knife. 21 scratches. 22. 23. Their food was running low. Their water was nearly gone. Their daughter had begun crying in her sleep. Daniel had stopped speaking altogether. And Elias had begun wondering whether they would ever see daylight again. Then, on the 24th night, everything changed. The scratching stopped. The howling stopped. The house became completely silent. Elias sat awake beside the front door, shotgun in his lap. He waited. 1 hour. 2. 3. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him into sleep. When he opened his eyes, sunlight was pouring through the cracks between the boards. Morning. For the first time in weeks, there was no screaming outside. No scratching. No footsteps. Nothing. Elias slowly stood. Margaret was already awake. She looked at him. "They're gone." Elias didn't answer. He approached the front door. The barricades were still in place. The wooden boards were scarred deeply. There were gouges in the door nearly an inch deep. But there was no blood. No bodies. Nothing. Daniel whispered from behind them. Maybe they're dead. Elias looked toward the windows. The forest was perfectly still. Finally, he said the words everyone had been waiting to hear. We're going outside. Margaret grabbed his arm. Are you sure? Elias nodded. We can't stay here forever. They removed the barricades. Slowly. Carefully. The front door groaned as Elias opened it. Morning sunlight spilled across the porch. Margaret stepped outside first. She squinted. Fresh air touched her face. For a moment, she simply stood there. Then she smiled. Oh God! She laughed. A tiny, exhausted laugh. We made it. Daniel stepped outside. Then their daughter. Elias followed. They stood together on the porch, looking across the farm. Nothing moved. No monsters. No bodies. No signs of an attack. Just the familiar fields. The barn. The old fence. The trees. Elias felt something strange. A sensation he couldn't explain. He looked down. There were dark stains on the porch. He crouched. Blood. Fresh blood. Margaret noticed it too. What is that? Elias touched it. Then looked at his fingers. The blood was still warm. He slowly raised his head. There were more stains leading down the steps. And more beyond them. A trail. It disappeared toward the side of the house. Elias followed it. Margaret called after him. Elias! He kept walking. The blood led around the farmhouse. Then stopped beneath the kitchen window. Elias stared at the ground. There were footprints. But they weren't human. They were enormous. Long, narrow impressions with deep claw marks. He followed them. One step. Then another. They led around the house, toward the front yard, then toward the woods. But halfway there Elias stopped, because the footprints suddenly changed. The next prints were human, bare feet. Small at first, then larger. Dozens of them. Walking toward the house. Margaret came up behind him. What? Elias didn't respond. He was staring at the dirt. There were human footprints everywhere. Around the house. Under the windows. On the porch. Beside the doors. As if dozens of people had been walking around the farmhouse every night. But there was something else. Something much worse. The footprints didn't lead toward the forest. They led out of the forest. Elias slowly turned toward the farmhouse. The morning sunlight illuminated the walls. And suddenly, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The boards covering the windows weren't nailed from the inside. They were nailed from the outside. He stared. His stomach tightened. No. Margaret looked confused. What? Elias walked to the nearest window. He touched the wooden plank. The nails were driven through the boards and into the frame. From outside. Every window. Every door. Every barricade. His hands began shaking. Who boarded us in? Margaret stared at him. Neither of them spoke. Then Daniel screamed. They turned. Their daughter was standing near the barn. She was staring at the ground. Dad! Elias ran toward her. She pointed. There was something half buried beneath the mud. A human hand. Elias froze. Then he saw another. And another. He began digging. Margaret screamed. Stop! But Elias kept digging. He uncovered a body. A man. Middle-aged. His face was frozen in terror. His throat had been torn open. The man's clothes were covered in blood. Elias stared at him. He recognized the face. Everyone in the county did. It was the farmer who had owned this property before them. The man who had supposedly disappeared 3 weeks ago. Margaret backed away. No! Then Elias heard something behind him. A low growl. He turned. Daniel was standing several feet away. His head was tilted. His shoulders were hunched. His mouth was hanging open. Elias! Margaret whispered his name. Daniel smiled. But it wasn't Daniel's smile. His lips pulled too far apart. His teeth looked longer, sharper. Margaret screamed. Daniel lunged. Elias stumbled backward, then stopped. Because something inside his chest was moving. His ribs shifted beneath his shirt. Not breathing. Moving. Like fingers were crawling underneath his skin. Margaret collapsed to her knees. Her daughter began laughing. Not a child's laugh. A deep, broken sound. A sound that seemed to come from somewhere much older. Elias grabbed his face. His fingernails dug into his cheeks. He felt something beneath his skin. Something that had been sleeping. Something that was waking up. His jaw cracked. Once. Twice. Then his mouth stretched impossibly wide. Margaret screamed again. But the scream changed halfway through. It became a howl. A long, terrible howl that echoed across the valley. Elias dropped to all fours. His fingers lengthened. His fingernails split. Black claws pushed through them. His spine twisted violently beneath his shirt. Bones rearranged themselves with wet popping sounds. His face elongated. His eyes turned milky white. And suddenly memories came flooding back. Not memories of being trapped. Memories of hunting. He remembered the farmhouse. He remembered the previous family. He remembered watching them through the trees. He remembered following them home. He remembered breaking through their windows. He remembered the screaming. He remembered the smell of their blood. And then he remembered something else. They hadn't moved into the farmhouse. They had taken it. The family had been inside when the Mercers arrived. The Mercers had killed them. They had eaten them. They had hidden their bodies beneath the barn. Then they had forgotten. Forgotten who they were. Forgotten what they were. The boards on the windows weren't protection. They were containment. Someone had built the farmhouse like a cage. Someone had been trying to keep the creatures inside. And every night, the scratching outside hadn't been monsters trying to get in. It had been people trying to get them out. The howling hadn't been a threat. It had been a warning. A desperate warning from the neighbors. Elias looked toward the forest. There were hundreds of people standing between the trees. Men, women, children. All watching. All terrified. Some held rifles. Some held torches. Nobody approached. Nobody needed to. Because the creatures were already awake. Margaret stood beside Elias. Except she wasn't Margaret anymore. Her body had become something thin and crooked. Her arms hung nearly to her knees. Her fingers dragged through the dirt. She looked at Elias and smiled. What should we do now? Elias looked toward the valley, toward the tiny houses, toward the distant road, toward the people who had spent weeks keeping watch. Then he inhaled. The smell of human beings filled his lungs. Warm. Alive. Abundant. His mouth opened. And the entire family began to howl. The sound rolled across the mountains. Doors slammed throughout the valley. Lights flickered on. People ran. Elias watched them scatter. For the first time in weeks, he understood the truth. The farmhouse had never been their sanctuary. It had been their den. And the thing they had believed was hunting them had actually been keeping them contained. The Mercers stepped off the porch. Together. Barefoot. Smiling. And behind them, the farmhouse stood open to the morning sunlight. Its walls were covered in claw marks. Its floors were stained black. And carved into the inside of the front door, beneath years of blood and scratches, were 5 simple words. Do not let them out.